Welcome back to this series introducing Herman Dooyeweerd's roots of Western culture. In this episode, we will look at the ancient Greek religious ground motive of matter and form. As before, I'll give a summary of the section and then focus in on some of the key issues. The ancient Greek religious ground motive of matter and form came from a conflict between the older nature religions and the newer religions of the Olympian gods. Now we need to remember, of course, that Western culture is not something self-contained, but right from its beginning it had influences from outside. This is especially evident in the matter motive, which deified the cyclical stream of life and death. In this motive we have themes of mystery and fate, as well as ideas of reincarnation. The later form motive deified the idealized cultural forces, so ideas of beauty and power, of wisdom and wealth become personified in the Olympian gods. These suprasensible, immortal beings could provide perhaps a model for the aristocratic Greeks, but couldn't really explain and deal with the mysteries of life and death. And so the old matter motive doesn't die away. In fact, Dooyeweerd points out that within the Olympian gods, Dionysus represents and tries to incorporate elements from the older matter motive, where Apollo stands in for the form and measure and harmony of the culture religion. Now, the important point to notice is that both of these motives identify genuine elements of human experience. Dooyeweerd talks about the aspect of movement in terms of the matter motive and the cultural aspect for the cultural motive, although perhaps given his emphasis on life and death, it might make more sense to talk about the aspect rather of kind of organic life. One of the reasons for focusing in on the matter and form motive is to see that this religious dialectic also produces further dialectical tensions and other oppositions, for example, the opposition between body and soul, as well as opposition between kind of rational theory and ungrounded, opinionated belief. Dooyeweerd uses the Greek idea of the state to illustrate the ground motive of matter and form. So the Greek polis embodied the form motive and was thought to encompass the whole of a person's life, so that the polis was necessary to form human life in a civilized way. And outside of the Greek polis, everything is savagery, and the Greeks are to be distinguished from the barbarians outside. This idea of the power of the state and the encompassing nature of the state is developed further in the worship of the political leader in Alexander the Great, and this leads to the development of a motive of power, according to Dooyeweerd, in the Roman Imperium. Within the Roman Empire, though, both form matter and matter motive continue. So the form matter becomes connected with public law, whereas the matter motive becomes connected with the Roman familiae, which maintains power over life and death. Within this context, though, and despite some kind of negative criticism of the kind of totalitarian nature of political power in Greek thought, Dooyeweerd praises the discovery of the idea of natural law and calls it an outstanding discovery and a gift of God's common grace. This, however, falls away later under the Byzantine emperors, where state absolutism becomes re-established. I've decided this time to focus a bit more on themes rather than a particular passage. And so for this little section of the book, one of the things I thought would be worth looking at in a bit more detail is Dooyeweerd's idea of a religious dialectic, and see if we can understand a bit more how it works, and this idea that it grows out of or is based on a fundamental coherence of reality and yet develops into a conflict. So he says on page 21, they, being the form motive and the matter motive, presuppose each other and determine each other's meaning. So try and think a little bit about why that is. The first thing to understand is that both motives identify genuine aspects of reality. Now, this reference to aspects kind of throws up Dooyeweerd's more general philosophy, where he talks about the richness of created reality in terms of different dimensions or aspects of reality. And so he identifies the matter motive with the aspect of movement, although, as I've mentioned before, it probably makes more sense to identify it with the aspect of organic life, or the biotic aspect, Dooyeweerd sometimes calls it. The form motive is identified by Dooyeweerd with the cultural aspect of human life. Now, these aspects naturally fit together. They're part of the rich coherence of created reality, and as such they support each other. So there cannot be culture without life, but equally there cannot be human life without a cultural environment in which human life can live. So as long as we recognize these aspects as relative dimensions of human experience, then we can see how they fit together. And it's only when they're made absolute that they come into conflict, because once you make one of the aspects absolute, then it tends to exclude the other, and this is what leads to the conflict between the different elements of the dialectic. We might wonder why Dooyeweerd spends this time on looking at the Greek ground motive of matter and form, but one of the reasons for that is that the religious dialectic leads to further oppositions, and these oppositions have also had their influence within Western culture. So he identifies a couple on the pages 20 to 21. So first of all, there's the opposition between an immortal soul that comes from heaven and that is imprisoned in a material body. There's also in here ideas of reincarnation, which would have been picked up from some of the Eastern religions that came in and influenced Greece. But clearly this idea of that I belong in heaven and that earth is a kind of a transitory and imprisoned state has had its influence within Christian thought as well, and the idea of the salvation of the soul and going to heaven when you die and those sorts of ideas. So Dooyeweerd wants to bring out and show how that kind of opposition between a good soul and a kind of negative body has influenced Western society. Also at a more kind of philosophical level, but I think we see it even today in kind of a lot of contemporary understanding, and a sort of opposition between the rational, which again links to the soul, and opinion or belief, which also links to the body. Obviously in more modern times we have a kind of reason versus faith kind of idea, and this notion that rationality is somehow much more important and that faith is something negative, and that they're opposites still has an influence today. And we've already mentioned within the Greek idea of the state, this idea of the civilized versus barbarian. So that shows how the basic religious dialectic leads to further oppositions. The last theme I want to focus in on is really only hinted at in this section. Dooyeweerd was going to go on and develop in much more detail later on, but I thought it's worth introducing and saying something about sphere sovereignty because it's mentioned on page 22 and again a bit later, I think it's page 27. And it's in contrast to the more totalitarian ideas of the state that Dooyeweerd finds in Greek philosophy. Obviously, we have to remember that this is written soon after the Second World War, where totalitarian states kind of loom large on the political horizon. And so, and Dooyeweerd is appealing to sphere sovereignty, which was a well-established kind of Calvinistic idea in the Netherlands. So just to kind of briefly summarize this idea, is on page 22 he says that limited spheres of power ought to respect each other in their mutual relationships, and this already hints at some of the key ideas. So sovereignty is to do with kind of power and authority, and the idea of sphere sovereignty is that human power and authority is always needs to be understood as limited and limited to a particular area or a particular sphere. And also because there are many different spheres of human activity and human authority and human responsibility, we have to understand these as coordinated, as fitting together. So in a very similar way as we said that the aspects like of movement and life fit together and support and mutually relate together with aspects of culture, in the same way different spheres of power within society need to be seen as limited and coordinated. And a third notion that's very important to the idea of sphere sovereignty is that they are normative requirements for each area of power, that it's not just a case of might makes right, but there are kind of values built into the different spheres, or normative principles that even those in authority need to be subject to. So this notion of sphere sovereignty is going to be very important. It links into how Dooyeweerd thinks of the creation motive in the Christian ground motive, and it's going to be an important idea in developing his Christian approach to thinking about society and politics and so on.